History remembers Isaac Newton as a mind beyond comparison. The laws of motion, the foundations of classical physics, the mathematics that shaped the modern world. His discoveries changed how humanity understands the universe. His name became synonymous with intelligence itself, but history often tells only half the story. Behind the equations, the theories, and the scientific revolution, there was a man driven by questions far deeper than gravity and calculus, a man whose greatest pursuit was not knowledge alone, but truth. A truth he believed came from God. Few people realize that Isaac Newton spent more time studying theology than science. Fewer still understand how deeply his Christian faith shaped his worldview, his discipline, and his relentless search for order in creation. This is not the story most textbooks tell. This is the story behind the genius. Isaac Newton was born into a world of uncertainty. England was marked by political unrest, religious tension, and scientific confusion. The universe itself was still poorly understood, governed more by tradition than by evidence. Even Newton's entrance into the world was fragile. He was born prematurely, so small and weak that few believed he would survive. His father had already died months before his birth. His mother, overwhelmed by grief and survival, eventually left him in the care of relatives. From the beginning, Newton learned what it meant to be alone. That solitude would shape him. As a child, he was quiet, withdrawn, and intensely observant. While others played, Newton watched. While others accepted explanations, he questioned them. He was not driven by popularity or approval, but by an inner urgency to understand how things truly worked. The natural world fascinated him. Why did objects fall? Why did light behave the way it did? Why was there order instead of chaos? These questions were not merely scientific curiosities. For Newton, they were spiritual inquiries. He believed the universe was not random. He believed it was designed, and if it was designed, then it could be understood. This conviction became the foundation of his life's work. When Newton entered the University of Cambridge, the intellectual world was divided. Ancient philosophies clashed with emerging scientific ideas. Theology and science were often treated as opposing forces. Newton rejected that division. To him, studying nature was an act of worship. Understanding creation was a way to honor the Creator. He believed that God had written two books, Scripture and nature, and both deserved careful study. This belief drove him to relentless discipline. Newton worked obsessively, often isolating himself for days, even weeks, consumed by thought and experimentation. He slept little. He ate poorly. His mind rarely rested, but this intensity came at a cost. Newton struggled deeply with loneliness. He formed few close relationships. He was prone to anxiety, depression, and long periods of emotional isolation. His brilliance did not protect him from human weakness, yet even in his darkest moments, his faith remained central. He turned to Scripture not as a cultural habit, but as a source of meaning and order. He studied biblical texts with the same precision he applied to mathematics. He believed that truth, whether scientific or theological, demanded rigor and humility. Then, in 1665, the world changed. A deadly plague swept through England. Cities closed, universities shut down. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. Cambridge sent students home, and Newton returned to the countryside, isolated from academic life. What seemed like interruption would become transformation. In solitude, away from lectures and debates, Newton entered the most productive period of his life, in what would later be called his Year of Wonders. He laid the groundwork for calculus, optics, and the laws of motion. But alongside these discoveries, something else was happening. Newton reflected deeply on God, creation, and humanity's place in the universe. He saw no conflict between faith and reason. Instead, each strengthened the other. The order he observed in nature reinforced his belief in a rational creator. The complexity of the universe deepened his reverence rather than diminishing it. For Newton, science did not replace God, it revealed him, yet his faith was not simple or shallow. Newton wrestled with theology, he questioned doctrines, he studied early Christian writings intensely. His beliefs were deeply personal, shaped by conviction rather than conformity. He believed Christianity demanded integrity, humility, and obedience, not just belief. This conviction guided his character. Newton was known for his moral seriousness. He held himself to strict ethical standards. He believed that knowledge came with responsibility and that intellectual pride was dangerous. To understand the universe was not to dominate it, but to steward it. As his fame grew, so did the tension within him. Recognition brought pressure, authority brought responsibility. His discoveries placed him at the center of the scientific world. But Newton never believed science was his highest calling. He believed truth was, and truth, in his view, ultimately belonged to God. This tension between brilliance and humility defined his life. He could be fiercely defensive of his work, yet deeply aware of his own limitations. He could be confident in his discoveries, yet reverent toward the mystery of creation. Isaac Newton was not merely a scientist who happened to believe in God. He was a Christian who believed the universe reflected divine order. His story challenges modern assumptions. It confronts the idea that faith and intellect must exist in opposition. It reminds us that some of history's greatest minds were driven not away from God, but toward Him. And yet, this part of Newton's life is rarely told. Why? Because it complicates the narrative. It forces us to reconsider what faith can inspire. It asks whether belief might fuel curiosity rather than suppress it. It invites us to see Christianity not as an obstacle to progress, but as a foundation for disciplined inquiry. This is only the beginning of Newton's story. In the next part, we will explore how his faith influenced his scientific discipline, his moral vision, and his understanding of humanity's role in creation. We will see how devotion shaped discovery and how belief and brilliance became inseparable in one of the greatest minds in history. If this story intrigued you, take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of Christians whose faith shaped history, and let us know in the comments. Did you already know about Isaac Newton's faith? Long before history would remember him as a hero of compassion, he was simply a man shaped by faith, discipline, and an unshakable sense of duty. His story does not begin during the plague, but years earlier, in a world already fragile, already familiar with suffering. Understanding who he was before the crisis is essential to understanding why he acted the way he did when death came to the streets. He was born into an era where disease was not an abstract fear, but a constant presence. Plagues came in waves, leaving entire cities emptied, families destroyed, and societies destabilized. From a young age, he learned that life was uncertain and that death often arrived without warning. Yet instead of producing despair, this reality shaped his worldview in a very different way. Faith was not a cultural accessory for him. It was the framework through which he interpreted reality itself. He believed deeply that every human life had value, not because of status, wealth, or strength, but because each person bore the image of God. This belief was not theoretical. It influenced his daily decisions, his relationships, and his understanding of responsibility. As he matured, he devoted himself to Christian service, eventually assuming a role of leadership within the church. His position carried respect, but also enormous responsibility. He was expected to guide others spiritually, to offer counsel, to lead by example. Yet even then, no one could have predicted the test that awaited him. The city where he lived was densely populated, its streets narrow and crowded. Sanitation was poor by modern standards, and medical knowledge was extremely limited. When illness appeared, people relied more on superstition than science. Fear spread faster than truth, and panic often caused more harm than the disease itself. When early signs of the plague emerged, whispers moved through the city. A sudden death here, an unexplained fever there. At first, many dismissed it as rumor, but he did not. He had seen this pattern before, both in historical accounts and in lived experience. He understood what was coming. Soon, authorities began issuing warnings. Those with means were encouraged to leave the city. Wealthy families packed their belongings and fled to the countryside. Even many religious leaders chose to escape, reasoning that they could serve God better by staying alive. From a human perspective, the logic made sense. He had a choice. No law forced him to stay. No authority demanded his presence. He could have left quietly, preserving his life and reputation. Few would have blamed him. Yet for him, the decision was not complex. It was deeply moral. He believed that a shepherd does not abandon the flock when wolves appear. In his understanding of Christianity, leadership was not about self-preservation, but self-giving. The more dangerous the moment, the greater the responsibility to remain. As the plague tightened its grip, fear transformed the city. Streets once filled with commerce and conversation became silent. Doors were barred shut, windows stayed closed. The sound of carts carrying the dead echoed through neighborhoods like a grim bell of warning. Families were torn apart. Parents abandoned sick children out of terror. Neighbors refused to help one another. Even acts of basic kindness became rare, as every human interaction was seen as a potential death sentence. In this environment, despair was almost inevitable. But this was precisely the moment when his faith moved from belief to action. He began visiting the sick, fully aware of the risk. He entered homes others would not approach. He offered prayers, comfort, and practical help. Sometimes he could do little more than sit beside the dying so they would not face death alone. To many, his actions seemed irrational, even reckless. Why expose himself when death was so certain? Why risk becoming another victim? His answer, spoken and unspoken, was simple. Love is not proven when it is safe. He preached regularly, not from a position of distance, but from within the suffering. His sermons did not deny the horror of the plague. He did not promise miraculous immunity. Instead, he spoke about hope that existed beyond physical survival. He reminded people that death, though terrifying, was not the ultimate enemy. Fear was. Panic was. Abandoning one another was. These messages spread quickly. People listened, not only because of his words, but because of his actions. He was living what he taught. As days turned into weeks, his presence became a stabilizing force. While chaos reigned elsewhere, the communities he served began to organize. The sick were cared for, the abandoned were fed, the lonely were remembered. Others began to follow his example. Inspired by his courage, ordinary citizens stepped forward. Some volunteered to help the ill, others provided food to families trapped in quarantine. Small networks of compassion formed in the midst of devastation. This was not accidental. Leadership, especially in moments of crisis, is contagious. Fear spreads, but so does courage. He also understood something profoundly important. Spiritual care alone was not enough. People needed practical guidance. He encouraged hygiene practices that were advanced for his time. He urged moderation, cleanliness, and discipline, not as guarantees of safety, but as acts of stewardship. While many viewed the plague as meaningless punishment, he rejected that interpretation. He taught that suffering was not proof of divine abandonment, and that compassion was the proper response, not judgment. This perspective saved lives. Historians later observed that communities shaped by this approach experienced lower mortality rates. Calm reduced panic. Organization reduced exposure. Care reduced neglect. Faith, expressed through action, became a form of resistance against death itself. Yet the danger never lessened. Each visit to the sick could have been his last. Every shared breath carried risk. He watched friends and fellow workers fall ill. Some died. Grief became a constant companion. Still, he did not retreat. Instead, his resolve deepened. If anything, the growing death toll reinforced his belief that his presence mattered. Even when he could not cure disease, he could preserve dignity. Even when he could not stop death, he could prevent despair from having the final word. Letters from this period reveal a man fully aware of his vulnerability, yet completely surrendered to his calling. He did not see himself as fearless. He saw himself as faithful. This distinction matters. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important. As the plague reached its peak, the city was transformed. Entire districts were emptied. The air itself felt heavy with loss. Yet in the midst of this darkness, something unexpected emerged. Hope, not the shallow hope of easy survival, but a deeper hope rooted in meaning. People began to believe that their actions mattered, even if outcomes were uncertain. That belief changed everything. And at the center of this transformation stood one man, quietly, steadily refusing to abandon those who needed him most. As Isaac Newton's reputation grew, so did the isolation that surrounded him. By the time his work began reshaping the intellectual foundations of Europe, he had already retreated into a world that few could enter. He was not a man of salons or debates, not someone who sought admiration or applause. Newton lived inwardly, consumed by questions that reached far beyond equations and experiments. To understand him fully, one must look not only at his discoveries, but at the silent inner struggle that shaped his life. Despite becoming one of the most respected figures in England, Newton remained deeply private, even guarded. He avoided friendships, distrusted colleagues, and reacted harshly to criticism. His conflicts with other thinkers, most famously Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, were not merely academic disputes. They revealed a man fiercely protective of what he believed to be God-given insight. Newton did not see his intellect as a personal achievement. He believed it was entrusted to him, and that misuse or distortion of truth was a moral failure. This sense of divine responsibility shaped his approach to science. Newton did not experiment to dominate nature, but to understand the laws God had embedded within it. To him, the universe was not a machine operating independently of its creator. It was a sustained act of divine will, governed by order, reason, and purpose. Gravity was not a replacement for God. It was evidence of his governance. Yet this worldview placed Newton at odds with the growing philosophical movement of his time. Deism, which suggested that God created the universe and then withdrew from it, was gaining popularity among intellectuals. Newton firmly rejected this idea. He believed God was actively involved in creation, continuously sustaining and guiding it. Without divine presence, he argued, the universe would collapse into chaos. This conviction led Newton to explore theology with the same intensity he brought to physics. He studied scripture obsessively, especially the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation. He wrote far more on biblical interpretation than on science, though he never published most of it during his lifetime. These writings reveal a mind searching for coherence between the physical and the spiritual, convinced that both were expressions of the same divine truth. Newton believed that Christianity, as practiced by many churches, had been corrupted over time. He questioned established doctrines, including the Trinity, not out of rebellion, but from what he believed was a commitment to biblical purity. These views were dangerous in his era. Openly expressing them could have cost him his career, or worse. As a result, Newton kept much of his theological work private, sharing it only with a few trusted individuals. This secrecy further isolated him. While others saw him as distant or even arrogant, few realized the burden he carried. Newton believed he was living in a pivotal moment in history, one in which divine truths, both scientific and spiritual, were being rediscovered after centuries of obscurity. He did not see himself as a revolutionary, but as a restorer of ancient wisdom. His appointment as president of the Royal Society and later as warden of the Royal Mint brought him public authority, but not peace. At the Mint, Newton pursued counterfeiters with relentless precision, personally overseeing investigations and prosecutions. This role revealed another side of his character, an uncompromising commitment to justice, rooted in his belief that order, whether moral or monetary, reflected God's design. Yet even as he enforced the law, Newton's inner world grew darker. Periods of intense productivity were followed by emotional collapse. Letters from this time show paranoia, insomnia, and deep anxiety. Modern scholars speculate about nervous breakdowns, but such labels fail to capture the spiritual dimension of his struggle. Newton was a man who believed he was accountable not only to society, but to God himself. In his solitude, he returned repeatedly to Scripture. He searched for patterns, timelines, and hidden structures, convinced that history unfolded according to divine prophecy. He believed that just as physical laws governed the motion of planets, spiritual laws governed the rise and fall of nations. This belief gave meaning to his isolation. Even alone, he believed he was participating in something eternal. One of Newton's most profound convictions was that human reason, though powerful, was limited. Science could reveal how the universe functioned, but not why it existed. That answer, he believed, lay in God's will. For Newton, humility was not optional. It was the proper posture of any thinker standing before creation. This humility is evident in his writings, where he frequently emphasized his own ignorance. He famously compared himself to a child playing on the seashore, finding occasional smooth pebbles, while the vast ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. These were not the words of a man intoxicated by fame. They were the reflections of someone overwhelmed by the magnitude of what remained unknown. As Newton aged, his scientific output slowed, but his influence only deepened. His ideas shaped generations of thinkers, laying the foundation for modern physics, engineering, and astronomy. Yet he never claimed ownership over these achievements. He believed that truth belonged to God and that humans were merely its stewards. In the final years of his life, Newton became a symbol of intellectual authority. Kings consulted him. Institutions honored him. His burial in Westminster Abbey marked a rare recognition for a scientist, placing him among poets and monarchs. But even in death, Newton's legacy resisted simplification. He was not merely a genius who happened to believe in God, nor was he a theologian who dabbled in science. He was a man who saw no division between faith and reason. To him, both were acts of obedience. Both were ways of listening. Isaac Newton lived convinced that the universe was intelligible because it was spoken into existence by a rational creator. Every equation, every observation, every law he uncovered was, in his mind, a translation of divine language. He did not seek to replace God with science. He sought to honor God through understanding. And in doing so, he left behind more than formulas and theories. He left a testimony, a quiet, complex, often misunderstood testimony of a man who believed that to study creation was to stand in reverence before its creator. By the time Isaac Newton was recognized as one of the greatest scientific minds in history, another side of his life remained almost entirely hidden from the public eye. While Europe celebrated his discoveries in mathematics, optics, and physics, Newton himself devoted countless private hours to a different pursuit, one he considered even more important than science. He believed that understanding God was the highest calling of the human mind. Newton did not see his scientific work as separate from his faith. To him, the universe was not a random machine operating on blind forces. It was a carefully designed creation, governed by laws established by a rational, purposeful creator. The more Newton uncovered those laws, the more convinced he became that the natural world reflected divine order. In his private writings, Newton often described nature as a grand system of signs pointing beyond itself. He believed that the harmony of the cosmos revealed the wisdom of God, and that scientific investigation was a form of reverent exploration. Studying motion, gravity, and light was not merely intellectual curiosity. It was, in his view, a way of honoring the Creator by understanding his workmanship. This belief shaped how Newton approached science. He rejected the idea that the universe could exist independently of God once created. Instead, he argued that God was actively sustaining the cosmos. The precise balance of planetary motion, the stability of the solar system, and the consistency of natural laws all pointed in Newton's mind to continuous divine governance. Newton's faith was not shallow or inherited by tradition alone. He wrestled deeply with theology, often challenging widely accepted doctrines. He studied scripture in its original languages, comparing translations and historical sources. He wrote extensive theological manuscripts, far more pages than he ever wrote on physics, yet chose never to publish most of them. One of the most striking aspects of Newton's religious life was his intense study of biblical prophecy. He believed that history followed a divine pattern and that Scripture contained clues to God's unfolding plan for humanity. The books of Daniel and Revelation fascinated him, and he spent years analyzing their symbolism, timelines, and historical correlations. Newton was careful, however, not to sensationalize prophecy. He warned against setting specific dates for the end of the world and criticized those who used Scripture to spread fear. For him, prophecy was meant to inspire humility and moral reflection, not panic or speculation. He believed its true purpose was to reveal God's sovereignty over history. Despite his devotion, Newton was deeply private about his beliefs. In a time when religious controversy could ruin reputations or careers, especially at institutions like Cambridge, Newton chose silence. His theological views did not always align with mainstream doctrine, and he feared both misunderstanding and persecution. Yet this secrecy did not diminish the sincerity of his faith. In his personal notes, Newton repeatedly expressed reverence for Christ, describing Jesus as the divinely appointed mediator between God and humanity. He viewed the moral teachings of Christianity as essential for human flourishing, and believed that true religion was inseparable from ethical living. Newton's faith also shaped his view of human limitations. Despite his intellectual brilliance, he often emphasized humility before God. He believed that human reason, while powerful, was finite. Science could uncover how the world works, but it could never fully explain why it exists. That question, Newton believed, belonged to theology. This humility is perhaps best captured in a reflection attributed to Newton late in life, where he compared himself to a child playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell, while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. Whether or not the words were recorded exactly as he spoke them, the sentiment reflects his worldview, a recognition that all human knowledge is partial when compared to divine wisdom. Newton's faith also influenced his moral discipline. He lived simply, avoided excess, and held himself to strict standards of integrity. Though he was not always gentle in personal relationships and could be fiercely defensive of his ideas, he believed that honesty and truthfulness were sacred obligations. Even his conflicts with other scientists, such as his famous disputes with Robert Hooke and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, were rooted in his deep conviction that truth mattered profoundly. While his methods in these conflicts are often criticized, Newton's motivation was shaped by his belief that truth, whether scientific or theological, was not negotiable. As Newton aged, his focus gradually shifted away from public scientific work and toward contemplation. He spent more time reflecting on scripture, history, and the moral direction of society. Though he held prestigious positions and received great honors, he never seemed fully satisfied by fame. To Newton, the ultimate measure of a life was not recognition, but alignment with divine truth. Science, in his view, was a tool, a powerful one, but not the final goal. The final goal was understanding God and living in accordance with his will. This fusion of faith and reason placed Newton in a unique position in history. He was neither a scientist who dismissed religion nor a believer who rejected inquiry. Instead, he embodied a worldview where faith and intellect strengthened one another, each pointing toward a deeper reality. In an age often portrayed as a battle between science and religion, Newton stands as a reminder that this conflict is not inevitable. For him, the laws of nature were not evidence against God, they were evidence of him. And yet, for all his brilliance, Newton remained convinced that the greatest truths were not discovered through equations alone, but through reverence, humility, and a sincere search for meaning beyond the material world. His faith did not make him less scientific. It made him more attentive, more disciplined, and more aware of the mystery that surrounds existence itself. Isaac Newton spent the final years of his life watching a world shaped by ideas he had released into it. The laws he uncovered had escaped the quiet of his study and taken on lives of their own, transforming navigation, engineering, astronomy, and the very way humanity understood reality. Yet as his influence expanded outward, Newton himself turned inward. Age brought physical weakness, but it also brought reflection. Newton had lived through revolution, scientific, political, and cultural. He had seen England change, seen ideas rise and fall, seen faith questioned and redefined. Through it all, his conviction remained steady. Truth was not invented by humans. It was discovered, and ultimately it pointed beyond humanity itself. In 1727, Isaac Newton died at the age of 84. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, an honor reserved for kings, poets, and national heroes. It was a remarkable end for a man born into obscurity, raised in isolation, and driven by relentless curiosity. Mourners praised his intellect, his discoveries, and his unmatched contribution to science, but much of who Newton truly was went unspoken at his funeral. The theological manuscripts, the countless hours studying scripture, the conviction that God, not chance, governed the universe. These remained largely hidden, locked away in private papers that would not be fully examined until centuries later. For generations, Newton was remembered primarily as a symbol of pure reason, a man who reduced the cosmos to equations and mechanics. In many history books, his faith was treated as irrelevant, inconvenient, or merely a product of his time. The story was simplified. Newton the scientist, separate from Newton the believer. But history is rarely that simple. When Newton's private writings were eventually studied in depth, a fuller picture emerged. Scholars discovered that he wrote far more about theology than physics, that he devoted decades to biblical study, that he believed his scientific work was secondary to his pursuit of divine truth. This revelation forced historians to confront an uncomfortable question. What if one of the greatest scientific minds in history did not see faith as an obstacle, but as a foundation? Newton never believed science disproved God. In fact, he believed the opposite. To him, the precise mathematical structure of the universe demanded explanation beyond matter itself. Order required intelligence. Law required a lawgiver. Harmony required intention. Gravity explained how planets moved, but not why the system existed at all. For Newton, science described mechanisms, faith addressed meaning. This worldview challenges the modern assumption that belief and intellect are incompatible. Newton's life stands as evidence that rigorous thinking and deep faith can coexist, not in tension, but in dialogue. He did not use God as a placeholder for ignorance. He did not abandon reason for blind belief. Instead, he pushed reason to its limits and acknowledged what lay beyond them. That humility is part of his enduring legacy. Newton understood that knowledge, no matter how vast, remains incomplete. He believed humanity was capable of incredible discovery, but never ultimate comprehension. The universe, in his view, was intentionally vast, not to frustrate human reason, but to remind it of its place. This perspective shaped not only how Newton thought, but how he lived. Despite his fame, he never married. He lived modestly. He avoided luxury. He devoted himself to study, reflection, and public service. Even as Master of the Royal Mint and President of the Royal Society, he remained deeply private, almost austere. He was not an easy man. He could be harsh, defensive, and uncompromising. Yet beneath these flaws was a relentless pursuit of truth, scientific, moral, and spiritual. Newton believed that truth demanded discipline, that integrity mattered, that accuracy was a moral responsibility, not merely an intellectual one. These convictions influenced generations of scientists who followed him. Even those who rejected his theology could not escape his method: observe carefully, reason rigorously, and submit conclusions to evidence. Ironically, many later thinkers would use Newton's own laws to argue against the very faith he held. The universe, they claimed, no longer needed God once its mechanics were understood. But Newton would have disagreed. In his view, understanding the laws of nature did not eliminate God. It revealed him as orderly, consistent, and faithful. The predictability of the universe was not proof of divine absence, but of divine reliability. Centuries later, the questions Newton wrestled with remain unresolved. Where did the universe come from? Why does it follow mathematical laws? Why does human reason align so closely with the structure of reality? Science continues to advance, but these foundational mysteries persist. And in that persistence, Newton's voice still echoes, not as a man demanding belief, but as one inviting humility. His life asks a question that remains deeply relevant today. What if faith and reason are not enemies, but partners in the search for truth? What if the greatest danger is not believing too much, but believing we have nothing left to learn? Isaac Newton never claimed to possess final answers. He claimed only to be searching, carefully, honestly, and reverently. That posture may be his greatest lesson. In a world quick to divide science and faith into opposing camps, Newton reminds us that human understanding is richest when it remains open to evidence, to mystery, and to meaning beyond itself. His equations still guide spacecraft, his laws still govern engineering, his ideas still shape education. But his quieter legacy, the union of intellect and reverence, may be the most powerful of all. A legacy not written only in books, but in questions that refuse to disappear. If this story challenged the way you see history, science, or faith, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach more people who are searching for meaning beyond the surface. And let us know in the comments, which Christian figure from history should we explore next? Your ideas may become the next voice in this legacy.